Wildlife.
Hello, welcome to the Wild Viewer, and welcome back to another edition of Lost and Found! Dan Versus. Honestly, this show doesn't need an introduction. Like, just by saying Dan Versus, that title should instantly tell you that it was a very interesting show. So far, I've covered a lot of different types of shows on Lost and Found, and while some of them have been really impressive, others have been meh. This show fits right in the middle with Incredible Story Studio and Eddie McDowd. Or at least it fits up there with those shows. The chances of you knowing what Dan Versus are, however, is very unlikely. Because it wasn't on Nickelodeon, it wasn't on Cartoon Network, and it definitely wasn't on the Disney Channel. It was on a little network called The Hub. At that time, The Hub was another one of those children networks that I guess wanted to get in the game with Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. I don't remember much of the programming on that show, mostly because I didn't watch it most of the time, and also it's a very forgettable network, but I do remember it had Dan Versus on it. It also had My Little Pony, and it had some game shows that were basically life-size versions of games that you would play in a family game night. Like they had Sorry, I think they had Connect 4 too. Game shows were a bit odd. I never really saw them, but I saw promos for them. I really only went on the network to check out Dan Versus because that show is freaking awesome and funny. If you've never seen an episode or even heard about Dan Versus, I'd highly recommend you look it up after you watch this video. This show is absolutely funny. It's got a very creative storyline, and yeah, I'll repeat myself, it's funny! It focuses on a jobless middle-aged man named Dan who has anger management issues, who's always devising up wild plots to get revenge or even with something or someone that gets on his nerves. Basically saying that every episode focuses on a different topic that Dan goes after. The show doesn't have an intro. In this case, it would always just give the title and then indicate exactly what he's going after, which is basically the main plot of the episode. Every episode basically had the same exact format. It would usually start off with Dan just living his life, and then something would get in his way, cause him to get aggravated, and then he would always just scream the person or object that gets in his way, and then he starts plotting his revenge to go after this said person or thing. Majority of my favorite episodes are from the first season, and you'll kind of understand why in a little bit. One of them is called Dan Versus the Dentist, which focuses on Dan going after the dentist. This is because one of his teeth gets knocked out in an accident involving a stuffed bear he got from his dentist when he was a child. Ultimately, he just blames the dentist and starts to prove that he's an evil man that's trying to kill him. And then here's a classic, Dan Versus Canada. This involves Dan and his friend Chris taking a road trip to Canada to get even with the whole entire country after he has a little incident involving maple syrup, which comes from Canada. And then you got some really bizarre ones, such as Dan Versus George Washington, which involves a tree falling on top of Dan's car, and Dan ends up blaming George Washington because he started the whole cutting down trees thing. And then he sets out to get revenge on a dead president. Out of this whole series, I got two favorite episodes. One of them called Dan Versus the Fancy Restaurant, which focuses on Dan getting revenge on a fancy restaurant after it takes the place of his favorite sandwich shop. The other one being Dan Versus Dan. This episode actually focuses on identity theft, as Dan's whole identity is taken by another guy who steals his home, steals his friends, and basically takes over his whole identity. The thing that ticks off Dan is not only the fact that his identity is stolen, but this guy's completely ruining his reputation. All those episodes I talked about are just in season 1. There's a reason why I only spoke about those specific episodes, but I'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about the characters! So obviously we know who Dan is. He's the anger management, middle-aged, jobless guy who has a problem with basically everything and everyone. And then you have the other two main characters in the show. Interesting enough, while every other show seems to have a huge cast or even recurring characters, this show actually just stays to a 3-character limit. These are the only characters that you actually see recurring in every single episode. One of them being Chris, Dan's best friend and husband to Elise. Chris is a pushover and softy kind of guy and always gets dragged into Dan's evil schemes. Then you have Elise, who's Chris's wife, and in every episode she always seems to have her own little subplot, as she's secretly a Coverfield agent. Yeah, so this show kind of has a little Phineas and Ferb vibe to it. You got two characters doing something interesting, and then you have the secret agent spot to it. I wasn't exactly a fan of her whole persona with her being a Coverfield agent. I kind of felt it was a little out of place. Usually at the end of every episode, Dan and Chris, who always gets dragged into Dan's little schemes, always end up getting injured or in trouble because of any sort of scheme that they are pulling in that episode. However, whatever Dan is plotting against, he always ends up getting his revenge, maybe not in the way that he expected, but in a way that he is then satisfied with. So I guess in a way you could say Dan is both the protagonist and antagonist of this show, which makes it even more enjoyable. Now, I adored this show. I think I've made that very clear. But I've only really seen the first season of it. And this show lasted for 3 seasons. Lasted until 2013. And I'm sad to say I haven't seen any other episode other than season 1 episodes. So after the beginning of 2012, the show started to slowly hide itself into the Hub network and slowly went quiet. I wasn't able to watch it because I never knew when it was on. Trust me, I would have loved to see the new episodes, but they never exactly aired them at a time where it was convenient for me, nor did I even know when they aired it. They did a very poor job with announcing the episodes and eventually kind of just faded off the network. And then, one day in October of 2013 on Facebook, the creator announced that the show had been canceled. This is the exact statement that was written on Facebook that he had announced to everybody. And I'm going to read it to you now because I want to. I know nobody asked, but I'm going to do it anyway. Christian Pardis, James Jones, and Larry Reaper, among others, have been kind enough to ask about Dan Versus, the animated series I've been doing for the last few seasons on the Hub. It was created by Chris Pearson and Dan Mandel and also starred Dave Foley and Paget Brewister. Yeah, there you go. Giving truly funny performances as Dan's best friend and wife, respectively. Dan Versus actually won an Emmy this year for direction for Dan Angel and was among my favorite pastime. It has been cancelled. You're being very straight with us, just getting straight to the point. It has been cancelled for the baffling and inexplicit reasons that shows like Dan Versus got cancelled. I can't really explain it because it has never been explained to me. Occasionally, I would ask about the status of the show and be told that it wasn't cancelled. But when I would ask about specifics, there would be long, awkward pauses and then changes to other subjects, like the weather or the possibility of a government shutdown. This was the previous government shutdown, which gives you an idea on how long it has been going on. Okay. Finally, I had to just give up and move on with my life. This is actually not uncommon in my business. Things just sort of fade away, with a noticeable absence of closure. You can't help dwelling on it for a time, but eventually the whole thing just becomes a sort of fragment memory. This is really long. I'm happy to say that in the case of Dan Versus, they are pretty much across the board sweet. I loved everyone I worked with, the company was great, the network supportive, and of course the fans were rabid and vocal in their enthusiasm. The checks cleared, it's out on DVD, and it was fun, and you can read it. Alright, well, there you go, it's canceled. Oh. So that kinda, you know, that kind of sucks. Not even he knew why it was canceled. I don't know why it was canceled. Okay, maybe I have an idea. It was just never on. Dan Versus was definitely a funny show. Everything he said in that Facebook post was definitely right. The show was very funny, and it looked like everybody was having a really great time on the show. The unfortunate part was, I guess, the timing when it aired and the way that the network even handled it by not explicitly saying when it was on. It just didn't work out very well, and I guess the views just weren't enough for the show to continue on. Needless to say, Dan Versus... Why is my camera dark? I'm trying to... Oh. Oh. Needless to say, Dan vs. was definitely a very funny one, and I miss it dearly. I have not really seen it since 2012, at least the reruns of it. I found it on demand back in mid-2012, I think. And then after that, I just kind of lost touch with it because, again, they weren't playing it. But it was still a very funny show. So that's everything I gotta say about Dan vs. Overall, it's a really funny and interesting show. Now I want to hear what you all think. Have you ever seen Dan vs. or any other show on the Hub? If so, what did you think of it? Did you think it was funny? And what about the Hub? Do you like the Hub? Do you think the Hub should come back? Do you agree or disagree with anything that I said in this video? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching The Wild Review. I'm The Wild Reviewer, and you just saw me review a thing. Hey there, thanks for watching the video. Make sure you give it a like if you like what you see, and come back for more if you want. But maybe not next week, unless you want to come back next week. I'm just letting you know it's gonna get a little weird here. It's even gonna be a little creepy. Alright, I'm exaggerating. It's not gonna be that weird. But the show we're gonna talk about is a bit odd. And we all know what went wrong with that. Wildlife. Let's see if you still work. Are there batteries in this?